Okay, buongiorno, good morning, Dr. Pamela Acker. Thank you for having accepted this interview. I'd like to introduce you to our YouTube channel subscribers. So we are here with Pamela Acker, American biologist, vaccine researcher. She is a master's degree in biology from the Catholic University of America. And so she has taught science in a variety of settings, from middle school to college, since 2008. And what is of main interest for us, prior to working as a teacher, Dr. Acker was involved in biological research as a whole genome library maker at the Genome Sequencing Center at Washington University in St. Louis. And she has also conducted research in vaccine delivery. Is it correct?
That is correct, yes. Except for the doctor part. I'm actually not a doctor. I'm just a miss.
Okay. Master. So, yeah, I apologize.
That's right.
So, and she wrote for the Kolbe Center a book titled Vaccinations, a Catholic Perspective, published in December 2020. And this book has been translated in Italian by our publishing house, the Italian publishing house, Fede Cultura, in December 2021. So exactly 1 year later. The first question, your main focus is the problem of using cell lines of aborted human fetuses to make anti-COVID vaccines. May you explain a bit these points? So what is the issue?
Sure. Sure. So aborted fetal cell lines, most people don't realize that their use in vaccine development goes all the way back to the 1930s. And this was before abortion was legal in the United States, but there was some laws in place here in our country that allowed for forced sterilization of women who were considered unfit to breed. So were eugenic laws. And during these forced sterilizations, sometimes there was also abortions that were performed at the same time. And these babies were sometimes used for medical research. So the use of aborted fetal cells in vaccine development goes all the way back to the polio vaccine, which is one of the earliest vaccines that was developed here in the US. Yeah. And it's continued up to the present day. The current chickenpox vaccine here in the US, the rubella vaccine, the MMR vaccine, were developed in aborted fetal cells. And now all of the COVID vaccines that are licensed for use in the US were tested or developed using aborted fetal cells. So this is a huge issue for us as Catholics, because we don't want to participate with a crime like abortion. It's a very serious sin. And the use of these babies' body parts in biomedical research is a really something that should be very concerning to us. And I tend to think that the only way to actually stop this kind of research is to stop participating in the fruits of this research. And there are a lot of people who think that, well, you know, we can go ahead and receive a vaccine that's made in aborted fetal cells because, you know, there's some grave cause that affects us, you know, so if there's a serious situation where we might be in danger, it's okay to use these vaccines. But if we continue along that line of thought, our actions speak a lot louder than our words. And so we can sit here and say all we want, that we don't want pharmaceuticals that are produced in aborted fetal cells, but if we keep using them, we're not really giving pharmaceutical companies any incentive to actually stop what they're doing. And this is should be of a huge concern to people, because there's a lot of use of the aborted fetal cell line, especially HEK293, in development of other pharmaceuticals. So things like the monoclonal antibodies that have been produced for treatment for COVID, most of those were tested in aborted fetal cells as well as the vaccines. So this is a problem that is a lot bigger, I think, than people realized it was before the whole COVID vaccine issue brought it really kind of to the forefront.
Pfizer and Moderna have been developed using the cell lines of aborted human fetuses. but AstraZeneca should have been developed not using these cell lines. Is it correct? And do you think?
No, that's incorrect. So Pfizer and Moderna were tested in aborted fetal cell lines. So, and this was done at multiple steps of vaccine development. So when you're developing a drug, you kind of start sort of with a step one, and then if your drug passes that stage, you can move on to step two, and then there's some tests to move it on to step three, things like that. So aborted fetal cells were used for these tests to push the vaccine forward from one step to another 3 or 4 times each for Pfizer and Moderna. Now, AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson vaccines, these vaccines are actually produced they're manufactured in aborted fetal cells, because these vaccines are what's called viral vector vaccines. And in order to make a virus, you need a cell. And so the cells that these viruses are being made in are actually aborted fetal cells. So if you get the AstraZeneca or the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, you are going to end up injected with aborted fetal cell debris. And there's a lot of people out there who say, oh, well, there's no fetal cells in the vaccines. That's correct. There's no cells in the vaccines, but there's DNA, there's proteins left over from the manufacture of these vaccines that do end up getting into your body. And Dr. Teresa Deischer here in the US from Sound Choice Pharmaceuticals has done a really good job of looking at some of the dangers posed by these aborted fetal DNA contaminants, because they can cause mutation in the recipients of the vaccine. And we're not sure exactly how dangerous that is to individuals at this point, but we know that it poses some serious health risks.
I remember during the first phases of the pandemic that a lot of people said that the vaccines, the phase 3 of the development of the vaccine was not completed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And this is a different kind of a less scientific question. And I have often the impression that one of the main obstacles to debate about these issues is the huge amount of people who are against the use of vaccines and who spread a lot of fake news, often ridiculous information about this topic, as for example, the existence of subcutaneous microchips, the link between vaccines and 5G technology, etc. What do you think about this fake news? Do you agree with me that they sabotage the scientific debate in some way? Because we appear as ridiculous to who endorse the use of the anti-COVID vaccines.
Sure. No, I think a lot of the concerns are, and you'd have to sort of deal with each one specifically to kind of unpack everything about it. But that actually becomes part of the problem, because people go down these rabbit holes of things that may or may not even actually be physically possible. And they can, it's kind of alarming to see how quickly, once you believe that the pharmaceutical companies are just wholesale lying to you, how quickly you will believe other people who are actually also lying to you. And that's been kind of my biggest concern with some of the supposed biotechnology links here with the COVID vaccines. People get very concerned about the word nanoparticle, and all that nanoparticle means with the mRNA vaccine is that you've taken the mRNA and you've encapsulated it in a drop of fat. That's all it means. It's not something that somehow is artificially intelligent. It's not something that's somehow going to be broadcasting biological information about you up to the cloud. I mean, these things are a little bit ridiculous, quite honestly. And it's concerning to see how many serious Catholics actually give them credence. Now we've got some really outspoken proponents of the whole, biotechnology takeover here in the US. I won't name names because I don't do that generally when I'm talking, but there's some of them that just they'll string together things that are sort of based in reality somewhat, like hydrogel. there is a substance that you can inject underneath the skin that can help in monitoring bodily functions, things like oxygen and blood glucose and things like that. But in order to actually get a readout from this hydrogel that you inject subcutaneously, you've got to have a sensor on your arm. It's probably about this big. Yeah. You wouldn't just not notice that, this isn't something that can be done to you surreptitiously. And I think that's the biggest fear that everybody has, is that somehow there's something going on here that's very sinister that we can't know about. And what I generally try to remind people is, there are enough safety concerns that we do know about with these COVID vaccines. There's enough ethical concerns in terms of them being produced and developed in abortifetal cells. And then, kind of all you have to do is look at the side effects in terms of the myocarditis and the pericarditis and the micro blood clotting and the neurological side effects to know that you really don't want this in your body. You don't really need to invent these ad hoc hypotheses about all of this, nanotechnology that really isn't even technically feasible. And I think people also don't understand that biological systems are really messy. And a lot of people have concerns about gene editing, and that somehow the mRNA is gonna alter your genome. And there's probably a small chance that in some individuals that are like currently infected with a retrovirus, where there's some reverse transcriptase that's really active, that you could potentially get vaccine mRNA incorporated into your genome. But for the average person, this really isn't a concern. It's certainly much less of a concern than things that have actually been documented, like the swelling in the heart and the swelling in the pericardium, the sac around the heart that protects it from injury. So, generally speaking, if something causes you to panic, you might need to kind of stop and put the brakes on a little bit and say, maybe I need to reevaluate this. Maybe I need to, it just kind of takes some of these more outlandish claims with a grain of salt and go back to what do we actually know? What evidence have we actually seen that these vaccines are, safe or not safe, that they're effective or not effective? Yeah. And unfortunately, the evidence, as I've said, is they're not really terribly safe, and they're also not terribly effective. Even the UK Ministry of Health towards the end of last year was already pointing out that there's a lot of breakthrough infections in vaccinated people, and their data showed very clearly that there was still a significant risk of infection after one dose of vaccine, or even after 2 doses of vaccine. So these are the things we need to be looking at. Are these safe? Are these effective? Should we be employing these, rather than kind of going to this is again my opinion, but rather than going to the sort of extreme of, there's this surreptitious biotechnology takeover that's happening. I don't think we have sufficient evidence to really go there yet.
Yeah, thank you. In Italy, there is a strong rhetoric by politicians and journalists about the fact that the COVID pandemic is not going to solve because of anti-vax supporters. And so according to this rhetoric, about 10% of non-vaccinated Italian people makes coronavirus stronger than usual. Is this idea scientifically correct?
Not even close. That's actually, it's interesting that people will evoke evolution to explain things, how like viruses become problems in human populations. And there's a whole lot of different nuances and things we could tease out here. The first is that really what we're seeing in a population is natural selection, not evolution properly so called. And it's a very limited phenomenon. So natural selection is basically when an environment places some kind of selective pressure on a population, and some individuals in that population, they have some kind of trait that allows them to survive better. And some individuals in that population don't have that trait, and so they're not as likely to survive. And so you see this actually all the time. You can see this in real time. You can see it in very short generation times, that things like finch beaks will get larger during droughts, and then they'll go back to being smaller after a drought is over. Lizard legs will get longer as a predator is introduced onto an island population, and then they'll go back to being the length that they were as the population kind of stabilizes out, and the lizards shift their ecological niche out of the range of predators a little bit more. I mean, you see this kind of really all the time, where you have this like oscillation around a mean. You have a selective pressure that's introduced, and then it causes a small shift in the population, and then the selective pressure is removed, and you have the shift of the population back. So people who are arguing that the unvaccinated are causing new strains to develop actually have it exactly backwards. If we're understanding natural selection properly, it's people who are getting vaccinated that are putting selective pressure on the virus. It's not the people who are unvaccinated. The people who are vaccinated are placing just like people who take antibiotics, place a particular kind of selective pressure on bacteria. And so any bacteria that are antibiotic resistant are going to survive in the presence of antibiotics, and they're going to replicate, and they're going to have a lot better chance of influencing the next population. We see that kind of same thing with the vaccines. So if we have a vaccine resistant strain, that vaccine resistant strain probably, it was already present in the population, at a very low level, but it probably is not as robust as the wild type non-resistant strain. This is kind of true across the board. This is true of antibiotic resistant bacteria. It's true of a lot of larger organisms that have supposedly beneficial traits. When there's no selective pressure in the environment, when there's no antibiotic, when there's no vaccine, these things tend to be outcompeted by the normal, regular, non-resistant organisms, because those organisms actually have a full complement of genetic information. Usually when you see resistance or immune escape, you see something broken or something missing in the organism. And so the only way that these can survive is if you have that external selective pressure that makes the environment favor that particular mutation. And so unvaccinated people are not going to provide that. There's no selective pressure in unvaccinated people. They're just normal, regular, run-of-the-mill. The average virus is going to do the best in the unvaccinated population. The viruses that are going to result in immune escape from the vaccines are actually going to be fostered by a higher rate of vaccination. So as much as I don't like to agree with Geert Vanden Bossche, I don't know if you've heard of him, but some of his theories are pretty out there. But I think he was onto something when he was talking about the idea that starting a mass vaccination campaign in the middle of a virus traveling around the world like this one is actually creates the potential for more immune escape for that virus. Now, he also wants to argue that we're going to create viruses that are a lot more virulent. I don't think that's terribly likely, because there's a trade-off for the virus. As it becomes more virulent, it kills more of its hosts, especially a virus that's transmitted through the respiratory system. I'm no longer going to transmit this virus to you after I'm dead. It's not like Ebola or some other viruses that you can continue to catch it from a dead body. I can't breathe out coronavirus particles on you if I'm dead. So from the virus's point of view, to become more virulent is actually less advantageous. To become less virulent but more transmissible is more advantageous. And we're actually seeing that happen as the viruses kind of pass through populations. And this is what usually happens to viruses. They get less, they tend to cause less sickness, but they tend to be more transmissible. And then they become what's called endemic, and they kind of circulate through the population, seasonally, and you have another common cold coronavirus kind of thing. So this is really what we're headed towards. And I think that people, again, they misunderstand natural selection. They think that because natural selection works and it's a real phenomenon, it's going to somehow drive this sort of upward evolution of the virus into something more virulent. But we've just never, that's just not what we see, in real life. So I hope that answers the question somewhat without being too technical.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I wonder, because in TV there are a lot of virologists, is it correct in English? Yeah.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, who endorse this idea. And
I think it's because a lot of people endorse the faulty paradigm of evolution. And once you believe that evolution is true, you believe in all kinds of things actually that are nonsensical, which is that you can continually get something higher out of something lower. I mean, this violates the principle of proportionate causality. You can't basically, and this is the first principle in philosophy, you can't give something that you don't have. But if you think that evolution is true, you think that this violation happens all of the time. You think that something that can't swim gives rise to something that can, and then something that can't walk on land gives rise to something that can, and then something that can't fly gives rise to something that can. And this is not actually possible. It's a contradiction. It's an inherently logical philosophical contradiction. And so really, if we were operating under sound philosophical principles, we would know that this is not physically possible. But most people who are working in modern science are simply operating under the paradigm that they have always been told that evolution is true. So therefore, all of these things that are actually impossible happen all the time. And so they don't even stop to think about, this isn't really a very logical way for this virus to progress. Because they're already kind of, I use the word brainwashed, not loosely, but very seriously. They're already brainwashed into thinking that impossible things are happening kind of all of the time, and have happened all of the time throughout, deep time. And they don't stop to question the philosophical assumptions that's based on, and how it really just doesn't mesh with reality.
Yeah. Okay, last question. There is not enough debate on this bioethical issue, and this is my impression at least, and astonishingly enough, the church appears to be silent on the point. Actually, there has been a document from the Congregation of Faith in December 2020, so the date of the English publication of your book, which clarifies that vaccination is not a moral obligation for the Catholic, and that the Catholic individual has the right to conscientious objection, especially when the vaccine has been made by cell lines of voluntarily aborted children. Do you have ideas about what do you think about this silence in the church?
Well, I always preface these kinds of comments with the statement that I am not a moral theologian.
Yeah.
I'm a biologist. I try to be a faithful Catholic, so I'm allowed to have an opinion, but I'm definitely not a moral theologian. So I think that the problem seems to me to be that the church makes two statements that are I won't say the church, I will say the people who wrote this document made two statements that are kind of contradictory, because on the one hand, they say it is permissible to be a conscientious objector, although that is very much downplayed in a lot of the documents that have come out lately. There's been a lot of emphasis on, you have some sort of moral obligation to get the vaccine in order to protect your vulnerable, brethren, kind of thing, which, if the vaccine was effective, that argument might be valid. But since the vaccine is not really effective at stopping transmission, you can't reasonably make the argument that you need to take this vaccine. You have a moral prerogative to take this vaccine in order to protect vulnerable populations. This is kind of the entire argument that herd immunity is based on. And I'm working on an update of the vaccine book. So I'm sorry, you've just now translated it into Italian, and there's going to be additional stuff to translate. But I am trying to work on updating it. And I want to talk a little bit in the book about this idea of herd immunity as somehow protective of all individuals, because it's actually not. There's no level of immunity in a population other than 100% that is going to prevent all individuals from ever being infected by any kind of thing. So, the problem is that, on the one hand, the church says you have, sorry, I did it again. On the one hand, the bishops say you have, the ability to conscientiously object. On the other hand, they say, it's perfectly acceptable to take this vaccine if there's, a situation of grave cause because the cooperation with the abortion is so remote. But that argument ignores, I think, two important things. One is that, if no one had told us that we were in the middle of a pandemic, if there were no mask mandates, if there were no vaccine mandates, would we have noticed? Here in the US, I don't think we would have. Maybe in New York, but most of the rest of the US would have gone on, as normal, just thinking, wow, this is really a bad flu season. It may be a little bit different over for you guys over in Italy. I know it was at the beginning of the whole situation, there was a lot more illness and death, I think, in Italy. But, when you're looking at grave cause, something that is transmissible, around the globe does not de facto or mean that you have grave cause. The rate of actual death from this virus is significantly lower, I think, than would constitute any kind of grave cause. And so you have to kind of parse out, what is the real risk here of death or injury from this virus? And then you also have to parse out, what is the real cooperation with evil that's going on? Because it's not just, and people try to say this all the time, it was just one baby in the 70s, right? And so it's true that the HEK293 cell line came from one aborted individual, and that abortion happened in the 70s, right? But that was not the only aborted individual that Frank Graham worked on in his laboratory. There's published literature that indicates that he was involved in the creation of other aborted fetal cell lines. When you look at the MMR vaccine, that the rubella vaccine component of that combo vaccine alone was the fruit of 99 separate abortions. Now, it was only one abortion that produced the virus that is used in the vaccine. It was only one abortion that produced the cell line that the vaccine is produced in. But there were 97 other babies that were dissected and experimented on in the course of developing that vaccine. So there's a deeper problem than, one baby 50 years ago. And it reaches forward into the present. And this is another thing I don't think people realize, that abortion tainted vaccines are used to justify all kinds of horrific research, things like lung only mice, where portions of aborted fetal lungs are grafted into mice. This is a one and done experiment. You can create one mouse with one piece of lung tissue. To get another mouse for another experiment, you have to have more lung tissue, which means you have to have more abortions. This is an ongoing thing. The Karolinska Institute in Sweden, for example, you can write into them, you can tell them, here's my experiment. I have all the appropriate ethics clearance, from my advisory board, please send me aborted fetal tissue every couple of weeks. These things are going on now, and the justification for them is the abortion tainted vaccines. It is the, quote, safe and efficacious medical interventions that we've developed already using aborted fetuses. So there's a much bigger problem here that I think people, and I think the reason that the prelates in the church maybe are not as vocal about this as they could be is because a lot of them don't understand the nuances of the science. A lot of them just accept that the pandemic is a grave cause and that the vaccines are safe and effective. And if you accept those things, then your remote material argument, again, I'm not a moral theologian. I can't tell you how good the remote material argument is in terms of moral theology, but I can tell you, if you don't have grave cause and you don't have an effective medical intervention, and you have other more effective medical interventions that are not tainted by abortion, you can't argue that this vaccine is acceptable to take, even using that remote material cause argument. So I don't know if I answered your question about why the silence. I can't really answer why questions, but I was able to at least give some kind of opinion.
Okay. So good. So we invite our subscribers to read your book, the Italian translation, Vaccinazioni, una prospettiva cattolica. Thanks for your precious interview. And
thank you very much for having me. And thank you for translating the book. It's really delightful that it's available in more languages now.
Yeah. We hope to meet you again. E grazie anche a tutti coloro che hanno avuto la pazienza di ascoltarci fino ad ora. Buona giornata and see you soon.
Sounds good. Thank you.